Let's recap what's been said in this 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos chapter so far, as it's been a little bit. Unless you're watching this in the future, in which case, are things better yet? Keep in mind, the name of this chapter is Be Precise in Your Speech. Laptops require electricity and internet to work, and those things don't exist in developing countries because corruption. Objects are either useful or in the way, and we perceive meaning directly. If we didn't simplify the world, we'd be overwhelmed. Somatosensory inclusion of our tools into our self means that we are our cars, and also our families, friends, sports teams, and countries. Bad thing happening to our cars makes us see the car and have uncomfortable questions about reality. We ended the last 12 rules video at the beginning of the section that we're going to start with today. And the idea that we left off with is that if you aren't precise, chaos can ensue. Let's see what example Peterson decides to go with to illustrate this. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to the channel. We are continuing on with the 10th of the 12 Rules for Life, and this one's going to be a bit of a doozy. There isn't anything particularly bad in what Peterson wrote, but some of the adjacent discussion might be too much if you've been in a particularly bad relationship. So, heed the content advisory if you have been in a bad relationship, and talking about this stuff can be difficult. Related to that, a lot of the experience-based discussion will be coming from the experiences of a good friend of mine and what she went through in the lead up to her divorce. I know some of the newer viewers aren't familiar with Lily, so let me just quickly reintroduce her. We met in grad school, became really good friends, and while there, she ended up getting married to a guy who wasn't the best. In one video, we sort of did a post-mortem of their relationship and red flags that were there, why she stayed as long as she did, and that sort of stuff. And I'm sort of being non-specific and understating things here because we are still in the introductory period that is so crucial for algae, so we'll get into more specifics later. Also, this is another warning basically that if this is stuff that's difficult for you to talk about, skip this video, just sit this one out. And since some of you guys were curious, just quick update, Lily is doing a lot better than where she was even last year when we put up that video. She asked me not to go into too many specifics here, but things are going well. And no, her ex did not get any sort of custody of the cats, and yes, that was a thing. Alrighty, so this is going to be a longer one, so quick refresher of the visual cues for the different trains of thought. This indicates I'm paraphrasing Peterson. This? Oh right, little guy popped out of existence last time. He knew it was coming. Well, that was easy. This means I'm giving my opinion or interpretation, and this indicates I'm talking about cold hard science. Alrighty. You're going to hear this from me a couple times in this video, but brace yourselves. This next part may be hard to watch if you've been cheated on by a partner. And the Petersoning that happened in the last detailed woman example, namely the client who didn't leave a product of his damned ideology, doesn't really happen in this section. There's still a hint of it. Why yes, astute viewer, me saying this section is indeed foreshadowing. Peterson describes a hypothetical scenario where a woman finds out that her husband has been cheating on her with another woman. And in this scenario, it snowballs from the husband just kind of being annoyed with the wife around the house, to staying late at the office, to having work trips, to yada yada, until eventually she sees him out with this other woman at a cafe.
The limitations and inaccuracy of her former perceptions become immediately and painfully obvious.
This is a hypothetical couple with a hypothetical cheater, so the details can match whatever story Peterson's trying to tell. But it's worth pointing out that the wife knew her husband was cheating on her by seeing him out with another woman at a cafe, and the clue was that he was interacting with her in a manner difficult to rationalize and ignore. That's all the detail we get. How fitting that a man who has studied archetypes for most of his adult life tells a story in cliches. Also, if you've been following the series a bit, you may notice that this is one of the rare instances where we're focusing on the experiences of a woman. And the question could be asked, why is this character a woman and not any other number of things, including just a generic person in a relationship with another generic person? And yeah, I am not going to give my take on why because I don't want to get sued. There are many ways a relationship can fall apart, and there's many reasons why one person would become a cheater. I've seen my share of relationships fail, and sometimes it was as a consequence of one person literally fucking around on their partner. But I only really know the more intimate details for the relationship Lily had with her ex. Since we are out of the super critical period of time in this video for Algie, let me be more blunt. Lily's ex was manipulative and abusive. They were together for over 10 years, and aside from periodic love bombing periods, he treated her terribly. He gaslit her to believe that she was the problem, that she was the reason their relationship wasn't better. And at this point, we aren't 100% certain that he had cheated on her, but we know for sure, at the very least, he was trying to. So, that relationship is sort of the prototype my mind goes to with talking about Mr. and Mrs. Hypothetical. As such, a question I had in the back of my mind reading this is if what Peterson was describing matched what Lily had gone through in her relationship. But there's a couple things that I need to keep in mind in doing that. If they are matching, that certainly doesn't mean that this is how it's going to be for all people in all relationships. How universal are these factors? If things aren't matching, is it because of variability between people in these situations? Is it even maybe bad or cliched advice? Is it maybe difficult to give broad life advice that will apply to everyone everywhere? Lastly, a caveat. The relationship Lily had with her ex is on the more extreme end of possible relationships that happen, or even ones that fail. Not everybody is married to or dating somebody who is so deeply manipulative and abusive. But these relationships do happen. And so it is still worthwhile talking about, especially if somebody who's watching this video sees something similar in Lily's ex relationship and their own, and then maybe starts the process of moving on themselves. Peterson says that finding out that her husband has been cheating on her with another woman, again by seeing them out at a cafe together, will have two main consequences for the woman. First, the person that she thought was her husband will now be a stranger to her, and two, she'll also kind of be a stranger to herself.
She is no longer the well-loved, secure wife and valued partner. Strangely enough, despite our belief in the permanent immutability of the past, she may have never been.
This is something Peterson expands on later, so we'll save the bulk of the discussion until then. However, I do remember early on in the process of Lily getting ready to leave the relationship, she did question if their relationship was ever real, if he ever really loved her. And when the pieces fell into place for who she was really married to, she did question if she ever really knew him. This leads into a discussion of time and our memory or expectations for events. And we get to the first hints of the Petersoning in this hypothetical couple.
Is the once reasonably content wife now a deceived innocent or a gullible fool? Should she view herself as victim or as co-conspirator in a shared delusion? Her husband is what? An unsatisfied lover? A target of seduction? A psychopathic liar? The very devil himself? How could he be so cruel? How could she be so naive? How could anyone? She looks in the mirror. Who is she? What's going on? Are any of her relationships real? Have any of them ever have been?
I can't quite figure out the right way to say this thought, but a recurring element in this book has been that identifying as a victim is bad. Yes, people should take responsibility for the things they have control over, but sometimes people can be a victim. Identifying as a victim in some circumstances doesn't mean that that person is throwing up their hands to never take responsibility in anything ever again. Some people might, but that doesn't mean that nobody ever gets to consider themselves a victim, especially as part of the healing process, ever again. Also, Peterson is at it again with the either-or boxes. It's conceivable that someone going through this could see themselves as both deceived and gullible. And while we're here, why is the opposite of a victim a co-conspirator? Does that mean Mrs. Hypothetical is potentially culpable in her husband's cheating? To go a bit broader here, something that came up in talking about this draft with Lily was that part of the gaslighting she went through was to believe that she was the problem. Some of these options, namely the unsatisfied lover or target of seduction, puts the blame on everyone but the person doing the cheating. This is something that will become more apparent later on. So shifting the blame off of the unfaithful person does set off manipulation flags, even if that wasn't Peterson's intent. Finally, specific to Lily, when she started the process of putting together the extent of what her ex had been doing to her, she did go through her relationship history looking for similar patterns and ask some of these questions. And she did find some repeating behaviors from her exes and herself. I won't go into detail here, but the linked video has more info if you're curious. And this reaction is completely understandable. The rug has been pulled out from under you. You're worried that there's more rug pulls about to happen. Something that came up while she was reviewing the script is that it's not healthy to stay in the I'm a victim mindset permanently. Part of the growth process is acknowledging that something bad happened to you and then trying to move past that to the survivor stage. Now, how long that takes for everybody is different. Some people can have to process through that a bit longer than others. Telling them to just buckle up, bucko, and get on with it isn't going to help anything. Moving the discussion out beyond Mr. and Mrs. Hypothetical.
Everything is intricate beyond imagining. Everything is affected by everything else. We perceive a very narrow slice of the causally interconnected matrix, although we strive with all our might to avoid being confronted by knowledge of that narrowness. The thin veneer of perceptual sufficiency cracks, however, when something fundamental goes wrong. The dreadful inadequacy of our senses reveals itself. Everything we hold dear crumbles to dust. We freeze. We turn to stone. What then do we see? Where can we look when it is precisely what we see that has been insufficient?
I don't disagree that things are incredibly intricate and interconnected. Despite the absurd choice of Peterson previously asking why we can't see atoms, the even smaller bits that make up matter and how they interact are certainly intricate. But I'm going to need a citation on the statement that we try to not be aware of how little we perceive. Repeating something again and again in this book without substantiation doesn't make it true. To repeat myself now, last thing before moving on. Bold choice to hold back on the precise language advice so far in a chapter on precise language. The section begins with Peterson asking what we feel the world to be when faced with unspeakable horror, like the towers falling on 9/11 or genocide.
What is it that we see when we cannot understand what is happening to us, cannot determine where we are, know no longer who we are, and no longer understand what surrounds us? What we don't see is the well-known and comforting world of tools, of useful objects, of personalities. We don't even see familiar obstacles, sufficiently troubling though they are in normal times, already mastered, that we can simply step around.
So this is why Peterson has spent the previous sections going into painful detail on his perception framework. To keep this part short at least, and not retread ground that was covered in previous videos, I disagree somewhat. The world can feel incredibly frantic and alien when something like this happens. I was just starting undergrad when 9/11 happened, and it's still a pretty vivid memory for me. But my perception didn't stop working. I didn't lose the ability to recognize objects. The world just got more complicated.
What we perceive when things fall apart is no longer the stage and settings of habitable order. It's the eternal watery tohu vabohu, formless emptiness, and the tehom, the abyss to speak biblically, the chaos forever lurking beneath our thin surfaces of security. It's from that chaos that the holy word of God himself extracted order at the beginning of time, according to the oldest opinions expressed by mankind. And it is in the image of the same word that we were made, male and female, according to the same opinions.
There's a lot that could be said here, but I think a question that gets at a lot of it is, Got any not biblical references to support this idea? Clinical psychology Dr. Peterson? Even a Bible reference to know where he's coming from would be helpful. Yes, I know he's probably talking about the first stuff in Genesis, but calling that the oldest opinions expressed by mankind is a stretch. You're never wrong if you never clearly say what you mean. In a chapter where we're supposed to be learning how to be precise in our language. If this were a satire, the writer would get feedback that this chapter is too on the nose. And maybe this makes sense to somebody who is fully indoctrinated into one of the Judeo-Christian traditions, but as somebody who wasn't, it's not clicking. It's all just style madness to me.
It's from that chaos that whatever stability we had the good fortune to experience emerged, originally, for some limited time, when we first learned to perceive. It's chaos that we see when things fall apart, even though we cannot truly see it. What does all this mean?
When we first learned to perceive. Is he talking babies here, or some other point in time? I'm not sure where the figurative ends and literal begins with him most of the time. Although I can understand the we can't really see chaos, but we can see it bit. Although in a chapter where we're supposed to learn lingual precision, you'd think he'd be choosing more clear phrasings. Okay, so I have something to work with moving forward. We're going to go with the point of this being that life is chaos, and order is an unstable configuration of stuff built on the chaos that breaks apart pretty easily. I want to prepare you because I know some of you will be terribly excited that this is showing up here. The Chaos Dragon makes an appearance.
Emergency? Emergency?
Hold on. This is some grade A, Princey A wordplay right here.
When Dave looks into a camera and starts talking, it isn't just a bunch of shallow wordplay disguised as poetry, like anti-social network and touchscreens make us lose touch.
And let me express first, Mr. Zuckerberg, not to be rude, but you should reclassify Facebook to what it is, an anti-social network.
If you aren't familiar, I highly recommend Nerd City's video on that generator of inspiration porn.
This is the sudden manifestation from somewhere unknown of some previously unknown phenomenon. This is the reappearance of the eternal dragon from its eternal cavern, from its now disrupted slumber. This is the underworld, with its monsters rising from the depths. How do we prepare for an emergency when we do not know what has emerged or from where? We turn from our minds, so to speak, too slow, too ponderous, to our bodies. Our bodies react much faster than our minds.
Chaos Dragon takes flight for all kinds of reasons, apparently. Car won't start? Chaos Dragon. Laptop can't connect to Wi-Fi? Chaos Dragon. Horrific atrocities? Chaos Dragon.
When things collapse around us, our perception disappears and we act. Ancient reflexive responses, rendered automatic and efficient over hundreds of millions of years, protect us in those dire moments when not only thought but perception itself fails. Under such circumstances, our bodies ready themselves for all possible eventualities.
My impression of the whole automatic versus controlled thing is that the automatic, all the way down to reflexes, is kind of the default way of life, like paramecium and stuff. It's only when you start getting more advanced that being able to control the automatic responses or reflexes really comes into play. And the way Peterson describes it here, it sounds like the reflexes had to be built up after the fact to prevent us from hurting ourselves. The contents of Note 163 are a book on the neuropsych of anxiety, a Peterson book chapter, and a Peterson and co-author paper. I certainly won't be able to get and read the book in time for this video, but I can get the Peterson stuff. We'll start with the older reference first. If you've spent some time with 12 Rules, this paper will be familiar. Peterson and Flanders are arguing for a shift in our framework for how we perceptually and cognitively understand objects. It's the whole we only perceive a simplification of the complex world, plus vision is inherently goal-oriented stuff. I will leave it to the viewer to decide the import of this proposed shift, not being reflected in the books that line my shelves. The book chapter is similar to the paper. Shift the framework, perception is a simplification of the world tied to meaning, you know the drill. Although, I guess now might be a good time to share something I was told in grad school. Advice from one of the research behemoths in cognitive was, if you had an idea that you didn't think would pass peer-reviewed muster, put it in a book chapter. The peer review process is much less rigorous in a book chapter, and that way you get the idea out there and you can start working with it in official papers. Food for thought. I do want to say that his choice of referencing here was surprising. When flipping to the back of the book, I was expecting to see something about the physiological stress response, a la general adaptational syndrome, but nope. The quick version is that there's 3 stages in how the body responds to stress. First is the alarm reaction. Your sympathetic nervous system kicks in because of the stressor. Second, your body's mobilized to deal with that stressor. Your temperature, blood pressure, and respiration rates stay high. Third, assuming the stressor isn't removed or resolved in some way, you risk exhaustion, leaving yourself more vulnerable to illness. Peterson says our stress response follows this process. First, freeze. Second,
the reflexes of the body then shade into emotion, the next stage of perception.
Basically, assess the threat. Third is the bodily stress response, with the Peterson flair of bringing in that we aren't competent or complete enough because of the stressful thing. Finally, pull from physical or psychological resources to deal and
parse apart the chaos.
This seems like a blend of the general adaptation syndrome combined with either one of the big theories of emotion or his own perceptual processing model. In either case, a citation of some form would be illuminating.
And so, the deceived wife, increasingly unhinged, feels the motivation to reveal all to herself, her sister, her best friend, to a stranger on a bus, or retreats into silence and ruminates obsessively to the same end. What went wrong? What did she do that was so unforgivable? Who is this person she's been living with? What kind of world is this where such things can happen? What kind of God would make such a place?
Since we're talking about a hypothetical couple, me using Antidote is fair game. A non-Lily friend had the incredibly awful experience of finding out that her husband and father of her child had been cheating on her for almost the entire duration of their marriage. And she didn't become unhinged. If anything, she went into cold precision mama bear mode. She wanted that fucker out of her life now. Just rip the band-aid off and get him gone. She was neither of those boxes Peterson lays out. Not everyone who goes through this will end up in one condition of the proposed dichotomy. Also, this point of questioning God seems right out of a Pure Flix movie. Although, as pointed out by my husband, this would be the same God that allows for childhood cancer, natural disasters, and everything else, really. Having said all that, the case could certainly be made that Peterson is only laying out one possible reaction to this sort of news. But it would be helpful to be precise in the scope of that example.
What conversation could she possibly initiate with this new, infuriating person inhabiting the shell of her former husband? What forms of revenge might satisfy her anger? Who could she seduce in return for this insult? She is by turns enraged, terrified, struck down by pain, and exhilarated by the possibilities of her newfound freedom.
Again, this is certainly one type of reaction somebody could have to this sort of news. I know one person who was determined to out-cheat their spouse when they found out that they had been cheated on. They're also generally a very scorched earth person, so it was very on brand for them. But again, that's only one type of response to this news. Both Lily and that other friend I mentioned didn't want any sort of revenge, they just wanted gone. And speaking of Lily, it was difficult for her to move forward for a little bit as the pieces fell into place, but she was still living with the guy because she didn't know how he would react if he knew that she had found out what was going on. From his pattern of behavior, it was clear that he was very manipulative and emotionally and psychologically abusive. But how far would he be willing to take things if he knew that the game was up? What sort of revenge might he seek? So, all the advice in the world told Lily to just keep on as if things were normal until she could get out safely. Fortunately, this all happened after they had a huge blow-up fight where Lily indicated she wanted a divorce, and in that fight, put a kibosh on the weekly mandatory sex that they were having, as well as other physical affection. Although, that was gradually being encroached upon by her ex. I don't know how many phone conversations we had in that time where we'd be talking and then all of a sudden she'd be thanking her mom for calling, but she really had to go because her dear husband was home. Click. Got it. Even the night we were moving her out, her ex was at work, we were there just throwing stuff in the truck, basically, and he called from work. And she didn't want to tip him off that anything was going on, so we had to stop and just wait. And had a normal conversation, and she broke down afterwards because she felt so bad for lying to him, saying that she was just watching a TV show and, it's fine, things were fine, how's work? And just, she felt bad lying to him despite everything he had done to her. My point here is to demonstrate that Peterson's not conveying a universal response to finding out that your partner's cheating. Also, we're not at the low point yet. Peterson asserts in several ways that Mrs. Hypothetical's marriage wasn't on a solid foundation, which leads her to spiral down into the underworld.
How did she get in the underworld? This experience? This voyage into the substructure of things? This is all perception too, in its nascent form. This preparation, this consideration of what might have been and what could still be, this emotion and fantasy. This is all the deep perception now necessary before the familiar objects that she once knew reappear, if they ever do, in their simplified and comfortable forms. This is perception before the chaos of possibility is re-articulated into the functional realities of order.
What? I know I'm repeating myself, but for a chapter on language precision, this is incredibly imprecise. The Petersoning begins, dear viewer. I am sorry. Mrs. Hypothetical questions if this was something she should have seen coming.
Should she now feel guilty about ignoring the warning signs, subtle though they may have been, encouraged though she was to avoid them? She remembers when she first married, eagerly joining her husband every single night to make love. Perhaps that was too much to expect, or even too much to cope with. But once in the last 6 months? Once every 2 or 3 months for years before that? Would anyone she could truly respect, including herself, put up with such a situation?
Peterson is implying Mr. Hypothetical cheated because he wasn't getting enough sex. A clinical psychologist who used to have clients is saying that Mrs. Hypothetical got cheated on because she wasn't putting out enough. We're going to skip the cutesy dragon-eating pancake story that follows this because it doesn't erase the seriousness of what's just been said here. The long and the short of what I dug up for why people cheat is that it's incredibly complicated. There's a whole host of predictors for when someone is or is not likely to cheat, and even then, it's not a guarantee. And to be clear, I'm not saying that no one has ever stepped out on their partner because they weren't getting enough action at home. What I am saying is that even in those cases, there's a lot more going on in the relationship beyond, I'm not getting enough sex. A frustrating part here is that Peterson does almost include something following up on the dragon story that's critical for working relationships: communication. But it's frustrating because it's almost entirely couched in Mrs. Hypothetical not putting out enough. Peterson argues that marital chaos emerges slowly. Things aren't said to avoid conflict, but that leads to a buildup in resentment and unhappiness, and eventually enough chaos builds up that it just blows the relationship apart. His examples here are of cheating and divorce, and he says that both parties knew that things were trending in that direction, but did nothing to stop it.
Don't ever underestimate the destructive power of sins of omission.
The sins of omission came up in Rule 8, which was the Tell the Truth chapter. This was the distinction between commission and omission sins. Commission being you knowingly did wrong, omission being when you didn't stop something bad from happening that you could have. Peterson added that historically the commission sins were viewed more negatively, but in his opinion, omission sins were just as bad. I almost physically felt this click into place while writing this script. While reading, I was a bit perplexed about why the statement was here, but from re-summarizing what those two sin boxes are, it made sense. Is Peterson implying that the husband's sin of commission by stepping out on his wife is equivalent to the wife not stopping him from doing so, thereby doing a sin of omission? Spoilers! Yeah, basically. It's been a little bit since we've taken a ride on a maybe train. A hypothetical marriage falling apart is as good a time as any to bring it back, I suppose.
Maybe the demolished couple could have had a conversation, or 2, or 200, about their sex lives. Maybe the physical intimacy they undoubtedly shared should have been matched, as it often is not, by a corresponding psychological intimacy.
How fortuitous. The maybe train takes us straight to what the fuckville. So, it seems the implication here is that the husband cheated because his sex needs weren't being met at home. This will become more apparent as the maybe train continues. But, recurring theme of my videos, things aren't this clear-cut or black and white. One counseling psychologist, in an interview about why people cheat, explained that for some cheaters, it's not that something is missing in the relationship, it's that something is missing in themselves. This hypothetical couple maybe could have patched things up by communicating their needs. The lack of talking about sex could just be one symptom of the underlying problem. And Peterson does almost sort of get at this later, but of course, it's dripping with Freud. Just sticky Freud all over it. It's a mess. Also, even being completely open and honest about your needs doesn't guarantee that they'll be met. That was certainly the case with Lily's ex. She had tried to set boundaries on what she wanted, but those were ignored or superseded by her exes. It didn't even matter if she wasn't interested. The weekly sex had to happen. This point bears repeating. If your explained boundaries aren't being respected by your partner, find a new partner.
Maybe they could have fought through their roles. In many households in recent decades, the traditional household division of labor has been demolished, not least in the name of liberation and freedom. That demolition, however, has not left so much glorious lack of restrictions in its wake as chaos, conflict, and indeterminacy.
We know that Peterson isn't a fan of divorce from the child-rearing chapter, but this is something. Does he understand where this tradition comes from and how it's shifted over time? I did a little digging here, and the study of family history is a treasure trove of interesting little fact nuggets. So the idea of the nuclear family, so parents and kids, but not necessarily extended family, goes back to at least the 1600s in some parts of Europe. And in certain periods of time, this was practically monetized. Cottage industries is apparently a pre-industrial revolution concept which saw certain manufacturing jobs being outsourced to homes. So the wife and kids were literally labor pools, and the division of labor was less clearly defined at this point. The wife and the kids and the dad, everybody was working. But Peterson is probably hearkening back to the post-World War II atomic family that most boomers were raised in. I checked the cutoffs for the different generations, and apparently, Peterson is just barely a baby boomer. According to Wikipedia, he was born in '62. I would hate the okay boomer to be factually false. Back on topic. The thing that's irking me here is that this wistful yearning for the good old days is bullshit. Some people can do the stay-at-home parent thing and be very happy doing it. More power to them. It's not for everybody. Combine that with the events leading into that period of time, where women were brought into the workforce to replace the men who were off fighting in the war, and then kicked out of that workforce when the men came home and wanted their jobs back. A taste of that freedom and liberation makes staying at home and not really doing much other than raising the kids and cleaning that much more bitter. Women's liberation did lead to some changes, among them a no-fault divorce. And we talked about this in greater detail in the child-raising chapter, but a no-fault divorce shouldn't be viewed as categorically a bad thing. Yes, having a divorce can have a negative impact on the children. Some of the risk factors have been identified, and things to do to mitigate those risks have been worked out. Also, it shouldn't be taken lightly that keeping a kid in a house with two parents who are constantly fighting at the very minimum isn't a great upbringing either. I have many friends and acquaintances, as I'm sure you do too, who kinda low-key resent their parents for staying together for the kids. They would have much rather had to deal with the separate parent situation than be at home with their parents constantly fighting about everything. Finally, what does it even mean to fight through their roles? Is it that they weren't accepting the gender roles that God or society or somebody had laid out for them and therefore strife? So they just needed to buckle down and accept that this is how things are and learn to live with it?
The escape from tyranny is often followed not by paradise, but by a sojourn into the desert, aimless, confused, and deprived. Furthermore, in the absence of agreed-upon tradition, and the constraints, often uncomfortable, often even unreasonable, that it imposes, there exist only 3 difficult options: slavery, tyranny, or negotiation.
Another recurring idea of the book is that tyranny of any form is bad, and you need to stand up for yourself in the face of it, otherwise gulag doom spiral. But the description of what happens when you leave tyranny hasn't really been included so far. The discussions of Solzhenitsyn have included his experiences in the Soviet gulags, but not the part where he got out and what that was like. Peterson has brought up tyranny being bad enough times. It would be helpful for him to refer back to one of those instances here to be able to explain what he means more clearly. But of course, this escape is only bad if you don't have an agreed-upon tradition to fall back on. Peterson explains that a slave follows orders, happy, perhaps, to shed the responsibility, but that won't last because eventually the slave will rebel and then the tyrant has to get the slave back into line. That won't last either, though, because the tyrant will tire of the slave because things are just too predictable. So the only lasting solution comes from negotiation, presumably between the slave and the tyrant.
But negotiation? That requires forthright admission on the part of both players that the dragon exists. That's a reality difficult to face, even when it's still too small to simply devour the knight who dares to confront it.
The tyrant-slave thing isn't talked about again, so not exactly sure what to make of all that. This ends up being pretty representative of a sense of the life advice I got from this book. Instead of working to change the existing power structures that aren't working, we need to learn how to operate within them, as confining and suffocating they might be. Be an alpha, like the mighty lobster. The traditional genders are the only genders, because Bible and symbolism. Physical discipline is the way to go. Screw evidence-based parenting styles. Yada yada. Put on your big boy pants, bucko, because the wisdom of our ancestors, specifically of the Western tradition, is how we're going to be running things until the end of time. Too bad if your truth doesn't fit within those constraints. Choo-choo. Keeping on the maybe train. Choo-choo.
Maybe the demolished couple could have more precisely specified their desired manner of being. Maybe in that manner they could have jointly prevented the water of chaos from springing uncontrollably forth and drowning them. Maybe they could have done that instead of saying, in the agreeable, lazy, and cowardly way, "It's okay, it's not worth fighting about." There is little in a marriage that is so little that it is not worth fighting about. You're stuck in a marriage like the 2 proverbial cats in a barrel, bound by the oath that lasts, in theory, until one or both of you die. That oath is there to make you take the damn situation seriously.
Pardon my French, but oh my fucking god, Peterson. Or, pardon my French-Canadian pronunciation, Este de calice de tabernacle, c'est pas possible que manque de cave. I see he's on the ball and chain sort of mindset regarding marriage. That's always fun. Some of us are able to take the relationship seriously, married or not, because we respect the person we're in a relationship with. No threats from Sky Daddy required. Framing the conflict in these types of relationships as fights is kind of unhelpful. Having a conversation about some friction happening doesn't have to be a fight. If anything, it's better when it's not. Less defensiveness, better receptivity, and all that. Furthermore, fights kind of implies that someone's going to come out the winner, or at the very least it'll end in a draw. My husband and I have been together for just over 20 years and married for a little bit under 20. We got married in a judge's office. We gave our families and friends 2 weeks' notice. We were in it for the long haul at that point, so may as well, and it was the quickest way to get my husband financially independent from his parents. We showed up at our scheduled appointment with the marriage license and the small group of people who were attending. And I still have a copy of the vows the judge gave us because I can be sentimental. And I checked, and it's got the standard love, honor, respect, good times, bad times stuff, and nothing about death in there. But I digress. I have a couple reasons for sharing this. First, I too have been married for a bit to one person. As luck would have it, the only person I dated. But we've been through the good times, bad times, ups and downs, and we've worked through it. Second, I don't feel like we're stuck together. I choose to have Dr. Mr. the husband in my life. We work through the harder parts because we want to continue to have a future together, not because we signed a contract with God so we have to sort it out. Although, funny story, my mother-in-law isn't very religious. Like, this story is the first clue that there was any religiosity to her. After we got married, she told us that we may not have been married in front of God, but we better get divorced in front of him. Still have no idea what that means. To beat the dead marriage horse again, we don't have a lot of information for this hypothetical couple. We don't know the full context for why he cheated on his wife. It's entirely possible that talking through things wouldn't have fixed it. Peterson brings up the minor annoyances that can pop up when people live in close quarters for extended periods of time. His example is one person having an annoying laugh. Lobster forbid somebody have an unbecoming laugh. What will people think? Possible ways to handle this situation, according to Peterson. One is to tell their person that their laugh is like nails on a chalkboard and be told to go to hell by said person. The other is to do nothing and allow them to continue to embarrass themselves in front of others. He says you should argue this out to get to the truth, that they have an annoying laugh. But if you don't confront them about their laugh, you can then play the moral superiority card because I guess you know that their laugh is annoying. And also build that resentment because it's like nails on a chalkboard to you. I hope it really doesn't have to be said, but don't go after somebody's laugh. That's cruel. Also, brace yourselves.
Maybe a forthright conversation about sexual dissatisfaction might have been the proverbial stitch in time. Not that it would be easy. Perhaps Madame desired the death of intimacy, clandestinely, because she was deeply and secretly ambivalent about sex. God knows there's reason to be. Perhaps Monsieur was a terrible selfish lover. Maybe they both were. Sorting that out is worth a fight, isn't it? That's a big part of life, isn't it? Perhaps addressing that and, you never know, solving the problem would be worth 2 months of pure misery just telling each other the truth, not with intent to destroy or attain victory, because that's not the truth. That's just all-out war.
As I said earlier, Lily did try to have these sorts of conversations with her ex. It didn't change anything. Yes, Peterson has included a maybe here, but I think it would be more important to emphasize that you need to recognize when your boundaries aren't being heard and what to do in that case. And Lily's ex was absolutely a selfish lover. She didn't get what the big deal was about sex until she was with someone who was interested in more than themselves. But gaining this sort of knowledge of what makes a good sex partner is still relatively taboo in a not insignificant chunk of the world. How is either party of this hypothetical couple supposed to sort this out? Although, this comment about God knows there's reason to be ambivalent about sex is interesting. Inadvertent autobiography striking again, mayhaps? Moving to the specifics of the maybe perhaps train, I would argue that these sorts of conversations should have happened long before marriage was even considered. Some people are ambivalent about sex or even don't like it at all, and that's okay. But if that's the case, they shouldn't pursue an intimate relationship with somebody who has a high sex drive. That's just a recipe for heartache. But it's hard to know these things without first-hand experience. Well, you can probably figure out some of it, like the degree of your sex drive, single-handedly, but being able to communicate that to a potential partner requires a bit of a frame of reference. Trying to communicate your sexual needs without prior experience has got to be difficult. But Peterson's repeated emphasis on the traditional way of doing things, including relationships, means that people would probably be trying to save themselves from marriage. And that leads to a situation where you're hoping things will work out after you've signed a contract with this person. And maybe you'll get lucky, and you'll have compatible needs and drives. And maybe you won't. What then? What happens if the truth that is found out after 2 months of miserable fighting is that you are sexually incompatible with your partner? Peterson adds a possibility that maybe this wasn't about sexual dissatisfaction. Maybe this couple had just fallen into a rut.
Maybe that deterioration was easier, moment by moment, day by day, than bearing the responsibility of keeping the relationship alive. Living things die, after all, without attention. Life is indistinguishable from effortful maintenance. No one finds a match so perfect that the need for continued attention and work vanishes. And besides, if you found the perfect person, he or she would run away from ever so imperfect you in justifiable horror. In truth, what you need, what you deserve, after all, is someone exactly as imperfect as you.
I do not disagree that relationships take work. That's how it goes when dealing with other people. But that doesn't mean that we are all horrifically and deeply flawed. He really has to hammer this point home whenever he can. What would a perfect person even mean? Is he talking about someone like Jesus? Because I really can't work this out otherwise. Seems like such an unproductive idea to give people, that they aren't deserving of someone perfect, so they should settle for someone as imperfect as them. If the framing were a little different on this, I wouldn't have such a problem with it. Everybody has flaws, that's just part of life, and helping people understand that they're not going to find somebody quote-unquote perfect is probably good, but this framing that they're going to run away from you in horror is not helpful. Something that struck me here was this seems to go against another one of his rules, namely Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. The perfection or imperfection of others shouldn't be entering the equation, but here it is. I may not have emphasized in the previous video on this chapter just how Peterson-y this section gets, so brace yourself for another volley.
Maybe the husband who betrayed his wife was appallingly immature and selfish. Maybe that selfishness got the upper hand.
Okay, this is possible. But it would be nice to model some accountability and responsibility for this guy who cheated on his wife instead of, "Hey me, I just couldn't keep it in my pants. Whoops."
Maybe she did not oppose this tendency with enough force and vigor.
So Mr. Hypothetical stepped out on his wife, but it's maybe her fault for not keeping him in check? What kind of logic is this?
Maybe she could not agree with him on the proper disciplinary approach to the children and shut him out of their lives in consequence. Maybe that allowed him to circumvent what he saw as an unpleasant responsibility. Maybe hatred brewed in the hearts of the children watching this underground battle, punished by the resentment of their mother and alienated bit by bit from good old Dad. Maybe the dinners she prepared for him or he for her were cold and bitterly eaten. Maybe all that unaddressed conflict left both resentful in a manner unspoken but effectively enacted. Maybe all that unspoken trouble started to undermine the invisible networks that supported the marriage. Maybe respect slowly turned into contempt and no one deigned to notice. Maybe love slowly turned into hate without mention.
This is the point where we see a potential different cause for Mr. Hypothetical's eventual cheating. Buried in this is a strong argument for a relationship fundamentally not working and divorce being an acceptable solution. Likewise, this is another point where having a conversation, this time about child-rearing philosophies, would have been good to have to see if they agreed or not. Granted, the best laid plans can go right out the window when faced with reality, but having some common starting position would be helpful at the very least. Finally, I'm not denying that this sort of scenario could happen, but it seems incredibly cliched. I think we're reaching a point where the tone of how this is being discussed is established, so we're going to try paraphrasing a bit, and if somebody accuses me of taking him out of context, expect to see huge walls of text as a response. The hypotheticals didn't talk about any of this because they preferred the self-serving narrative they could build up about how things were going. The wife could play victim and martyr, which Peterson argued could be more satisfying than a functional relationship. He puts forward that it's possible that she never really liked men. This could be from mimicking her maternal relatives' behaviors about men, or as revenge against her father, her brothers, or society. Here's the start of that sticky Freud I warned you about. When things were really falling apart between Lily and her ex, her former mother-in-law accused her of being a lesbian, and either having a piece lined up or currently going on the side. Just putting that out there. Not liking a guy with good cause in this reason doesn't mean that somebody hates all men. There's no fucking subtlety there, and this trope really needs retired. Also, in what world would somebody prefer and find satisfaction from a failing marriage that they are deeply unhappy in? Mr. Hypothetical's narratives could include also being able to play the victim or martyr, having an excuse to sleep around, justification for pursuing an incel or MGTOW philosophy, or letting himself go because fuck it.
Maybe both, wife and husband alike, use the opportunity to mess up their marriage to take revenge upon God, perhaps the one being who could have sorted through the mess.
Wow. Revenge upon God through a failed marriage. Really, Peterson? Aside from that, how many people willingly go into a marriage with the intent for it to fail? I mean, I do know some people get married thinking that it will change the other person, but to torpedo your own marriage?
Here's the terrible truth about such matters. Every single voluntarily unprocessed and uncomprehended and ignored reason for marital failure will compound and conspire and will then plague that betrayed and self-betrayed woman for the rest of her life. The same goes for her husband. Don't confront the chaos and turn it into order. Just wait, anything but naive and innocent, for the chaos to rise up and engulf you instead.
First, this idea that you are permanently damaged from this experience is fucked up. It's almost like the adult version of the chewed bubblegum thing that some kids are taught in the US instead of sex ed. So if you aren't familiar with this, let me make your world a little bit worse. So what these kids are taught is that their body is like a pristine piece of bubblegum, still in the wrapper. And as you go through life, it stays all nice and wrapped up in the wrapper until you have sex. At that point, somebody takes out the gum and chews it. And each person you have sex with is another person chewing that gum. Golly gee, wouldn't it be nice if you could give your spouse the gift of nice, fresh bubblegum on your wedding day instead of something that's been chewed by however many people? And part of this is if your gum gets chewed, consensually or not, you've lost your value. The parallel I see here is a form of finger wagging, you better not or else. You better not let your relationship get to this point or you're going to be plagued by it for life. People are incredibly resilient. This came up in a previous video, but people can endure, move on, and grow from a lot. This would absolutely be a horrible experience to live through, but it doesn't mean that they're damned until they die. On the flip side, there is a nugget of truth in here though. When a relationship you're in implodes, it's a good idea to go back through and look at what happened. What parts were you responsible for? What parts were out of your control? What can you do differently moving forward? And if you don't take the time to learn from this ultimately negative experience, you might find yourself repeating the same behaviors and ending up in a similar pattern. Just when I thought I'd be able to pick up the pace, this jumped out at me. Peterson is talking about this fight possibly being the relationship-ending fight, and
maybe your relationship is ending because you are a bad person. It's likely, at least in part, isn't it?
What the fuck? No! Bad Peterson! People are typically more complex than good or bad, and relationships can end in a complete shit show, or they can end civilly, or somewhere in between. Things don't have to be box A or box B. Don't basically call your readers bad people, especially if they're going through a breakup. They may have done some shitty things, but that doesn't irrevocably tarnish them. Most everyone is capable of learning and growth. This continues on with the people in the relationship avoiding having an honest argument because they may have to confront the truth that they are bad people.
Why remain vague when it renders life stagnant and murky? Well, if you don't know who you are, you can hide in doubt. Maybe you're not a bad, careless, worthless person.
Jesus fucking Christ, Peterson, maybe you're not bad and worthless? I don't solicit my depression for life advice for a reason.
Who knows? Not you. Particularly if you refuse to think about it, and you have every reason not to. But not thinking about something you don't want to know about doesn't make it go away. You are merely trading specific, particular, pointed knowledge of the likely finite list of your real faults and flaws for a much longer list of undefined potential inadequacies and insufficiencies.
In the larger context of the rest of this, it's almost not bad advice. If the framing had been a little bit different, like take stock of your strengths and your weaknesses, what you should be proud of, what you need to work on, it wouldn't be so bad. Even the part about taking an honest look at yourself so you have a finite list of things to work on instead of this nebulous mass of possibly shitty behaviors makes sense. But the framing that maybe you aren't a bad, worthless person is just unhelpful. It's almost like the life advice version of negging. Peterson reiterates and rephrases this idea of knowing your strengths and weaknesses for a bit with some doom spiraling and yeets before coming back to something we've touched on in other chapters. Basically, boundaries. You need to be able to communicate what you need and want to others, especially in a relationship. This phrasing is naturally not what was included by Peterson, and it was buried in the subtext, but I think it's fair to say that's what he was getting at. Mrs. Hypothetical is now on a path away from Mr. Hypothetical, and Peterson says that she needs to parse out which parts of her negative experience were unique to that relationship and which parts are just parts of being with a capital B. And she needs to go through this so she can see that not everything fell apart.
She can put the world back together by some precision of thought, some precision of speech, some reliance on her word, some reliance on the word.
Match. But then Peterson says that she doesn't have the drive to do this, or there isn't enough left of her, and kind of leaves her dangling in that perpetually fucked state because he's moving on. You ready for this to be all her fault?
Some earlier care and courage and honesty in her expression might have saved her from all this trouble. What if she had communicated her unhappiness with the decline of her romantic life right when it started to decline? Precisely, exactly, when that decline first bothered her. Or, if it didn't bother her, what if she had instead communicated the fact it didn't bother her as much as it perhaps should have?
Why is this all on her to communicate? Where's Mr. Hypothetical in this? He could have communicated his needs too. If Mrs. Hypothetical had a low or non-existent sex drive and wasn't told what Mr. Hypothetical wanted or needed, she may have perceived things as being fine. Why is she expected to be a mind reader here? And how is she supposed to know how much it should have been bothering her? In the Listen to People chapter, Peterson claimed that men and women discuss things and solve problems differently, and tried to provide guidance on how to deal with the delicate lady brains. It seems like Peterson's forcing the role of fixing this marriage on the wife, who's somehow supposed to realize that there's a problem at all at this early stage. It could just be me, but it seems like these two thoughts are incompatible.
Would she have discovered her resentment of her father and society itself and the consequent contamination of her relationships? What if she had fixed all that? How much stronger would she then have become? How much less likely to avoid facing up to difficulties in consequence? How might she then have served herself, her family, and the world?
The Freud stream just keeps pumping. Of course this would come down to some deep-seated resentment of men, particularly her father. How could it be anything else? Silly little women brain just getting things wrong. You know what? No. Sarcasm aside, why is this being put on her? Her husband cheated on her. The primary fault for the cheating lies with him. The only person truly responsible for the husband cheating is himself. Employing Freud here as a defense for the husband cheating is a cop-out.
What if she had continually and honestly risked conflict in the present in the service of longer-term truth and peace? What if she had treated the micro-collapses of her marriage as evidence of an underlying instability, eminently worthy of attention, instead of ignoring them, putting up with them, or smiling through them in such a nice, agreeable manner? Maybe she would be different, and her husband different too. Maybe they would still be married, formally and in spirit. Maybe they would both be much younger, physically and mentally, than they are now. Maybe her house would have been founded more on rock and less on sand.
I know I keep saying this, but why is Peterson putting the responsibility of the relationship failing on the wife? She's not the only one in this relationship who's capable of seeing what's going on, communicating their needs and wants, or pumping the brakes when they don't like which way the relationship's going. And of course, it's her fault that he ended up the way he did, driven to another woman's arms. How could it be any other way? More broadly, the micro problems that were brought up as examples in this section were things like an annoying laugh or childish behavior. And something that's a good skill to learn in all kinds of relationships, intimate or not, is what sorts of things it's good to let slide and which things you should worry about. Personally, I find quirky laughs endearing, and I hate when other people try to shame people to change something like that. Let that shit go. Just learn to embrace the weird laugh. Selfish behavior, on the other hand, is something to address. Details weren't provided on what that meant, so it's hard to be more specific here, but if you're in a relationship with somebody who puts their own needs and wants and everything in front of everybody else at the cost of everybody else, call them out on it. Either they eventually learn that that sort of thing isn't going to be tolerated by you, or they don't. And if they don't, you need to figure out if this is something you can let slide, or if you need to move on. But this runs counter to what seems to be Peterson's advice. He says that you and your partner are like two cats stuck in a barrel. I like to think that you're two kitty cats sharing a cardboard box. And what feels like a pivot from the central emphasis of this section, Peterson finally brings the maybe train into the precise language station.
When things fall apart and chaos reemerges, we can give structure to it and reestablish order through our speech. If we speak carefully and precisely, we can sort things out and put them in their proper place and set a new goal and navigate to it, often communally, if we negotiate, if we reach consensus. If we speak carelessly and imprecisely, however, things remain vague. The destination remains unproclaimed. The fog of uncertainty does not lift, and there is no negotiating through the world.
I think we can probably all agree that life right now is a bit chaotic. But our ability to talk about the current situation or the ongoing situation haven't really brought things back to order. Although I guess the case could be made that there isn't necessarily a common goal that we have communally agreed upon. But the recent situations have only illustrated that negotiating on some things only prolong the pain, suffering, and even the number of deaths. Stop being a baby and wear a fucking mask when you're in public. No negotiation. The police, at the very least, need to be defanged. Peace officers don't need military hardware. Precise enough? Broader perspective. Being able to communicate your boundaries clearly and effectively is important. But it's also important to be able to recognize when your boundary communication isn't being listened to. At that point, more communication, no matter how precise, isn't going to change things. Well, we finally reached the point in the chapter where precise language is coming into it. What do you think? And I know I said this a bunch of times in the video, but it's one of those lessons that bears repetition. It's important to be able to communicate your boundaries with other people and also know when those boundaries aren't being respected. If you're thinking about getting in a serious committed relationship with somebody, it's a good idea to have some communication about where you're going in life and what you want out of it, and your needs and your wants and kids and work and living location and all of these things before you really get into the committed part of the relationship. It'll just save you so much grief in the long run. And it's okay if your wants, needs, drives, desires, whatever, change over time. That's part of being alive. And you can communicate those with your partner, and maybe they'll be amenable to the change, maybe they won't be. That's fine. Hopefully you guys had a good run and can part on amenable terms if it's something that is going to break you guys apart. So yeah, that was this video. We should be able to wrap up this chapter in the next 12 rules video, and as always, like, comment, subscribe, Twitter, Discord, Patreon. Links for everything are in the description box below, and yeah, see you in the next video. Bye!